Welcome everybody to our ComAI lectures today for the first time, not at a university, but here at the Presse Club Bremen. So it's also for us an adventure if we can motivate the people from the university to come. But I would say it worked well, and there are also some people in the audience, at least I don't know. So my hope is that we somehow reached out beyond the university. We have a very, very special guest today, and I'm very happy that we could convince Axel Bruns, coming from Australia, to Bremen. But I had to say with 2 stops in between, so Berlin and Hamburg before. But nevertheless, we are really, it's great to have Axel here. I think, many of you might know him, at least the ones who are engaged in media and communication, so media and communication research, for the concept of producer-producage. So this is the person who coined the term many, many years ago. But Axel Bruns is also well known for many other things, especially his studies on Twitter. So he was one of the editor of, from my point of view, the first really important book about Twitter. Twitter and Society, it was called, and it was already in 2014. So, you realize what the big expertise is Axel brings here to this room. Beside that, Axel has published 2019 a book about filter bubbles. So also a concept which is quite widespread in public discourse. What Axel Bruns shows within that book is that that concept fully does not work. So we don't live in filter bubbles. It's much more different and also more complicated than this concept tries to tell. Axel Bruns comes from Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane and is chief investigator at the ADMS. I always have to have a look what it means. It means ARC, Center of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society, so ADMS. It's one of the centers we will hopefully collaborate very closely beginning of next year, when the idea we have on communicative AI might start. So it's still a decision which has to be made, but Axel Bruns and others from Brisbane supported strongly our application. The topic of today is AI as a research assistant. So we will change this semester a bit the perspective on AI, not only discussing how communication within society changes by or through AI, but also more reflecting on how we might use AI as a tool for investigating this. In that sense, the floor is yours, and we are all very happy that you could make the way.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and it's great to see so many of you here. It's been quite a while since I've been to Bremen last, so it's wonderful to be back and to be able to speak to you about all of this as well. I've been considering a little bit what to talk about here, in part because there is so much AI-related research, of course, already going on here as well. So I'm hoping that I will be able to tell you something that is still useful and of interest to you all as well. On my side, too, I need to acknowledge quite a large number of my colleagues in the Digital Media Research Center in the Center of Excellence for ADMS, who I work with, and quite a few people who've contributed to the work I'm going to talk about here as well. Now, before I go on, I want to do what we always do in Australia as a matter of course, which is to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which I have the pleasure to live and work in Brisbane. And that's in Brisbane, the Turrbal and Yagara people, as the First Nations owners of the unceded lands where QUT now stands, and to pay my respects to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits. We as a QUT community recognize that these lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning, and that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play a very important role in the QUT community. Now, you've mentioned the filter bubbles book and the work on that, and for context of what I'm going to talk about, I want to start by talking a little bit about polarization, because that is the theme of the 5-year research project that I'm currently engaged in, and that a lot of the work with AI as research assistant is contributing to as well. So I want to say a little bit about this concept of polarization first, because that's really, very important fundamental context. And I want to start with this image. This is what you get when you ask Midjourney, one of those AI image generation tools, for an image of polarization. And it's wonderful in how, well, wonderful might not be the right term. It's interesting in how American it is. If you look closely at this, you have two pale, stale males, white males facing off against each other. You have the colors of blue and red for Republicans and Democrats, or in fact for Democrats and Republicans because of their weird color system. You have them, clearly facing off against each other. So very much a binary system of polarization. And of course, all of this looks quite aggressive and, well, male as well, obviously. And that's interesting because so much of this really doesn't work if you translate it to Europe, for instance, where we've got multi-party systems, where we don't just have a binary kind of face-off between the left and the right, but very often it's in fact the center versus the fringes. And of course, many other colors of politics as well. So it's interesting to see that Midjourney as an AI tool, giving us an image about polarization, immediately defaults to the sort of the American version of polarization. And that, in fact, is one of the big challenges that we're confronting when we research polarization as well. So much of the research comes from the US and really doesn't translate anywhere else. Although, of course, the US, being what it is, tends to believe that it is an example for the rest of the world. And luckily, perhaps it isn't. So the reason I'm talking about polarization is because of this 5-year research project that I'm currently engaged in, which is grandly called an Australian Laureate Fellowship on determining the drivers and dynamics of partisanship and polarization in online public debate, based at the DMRC in Queensland. And it's, as you see, quite a large team as well that's involved there. We are still recruiting one more PhD student, so if anyone knows anyone, by all means, please feel free to let me know. We're very much interested in cross-country comparisons as well, so our team spans the globe. We have people from North America, South America, Europe, Australia, Asia, sadly not from Africa at this point, and of course from Australia. And of course, because we've got the luxury of having 5 years to do this work as well, we're also very much interested in a longitudinal perspective on polarization and how it's evolving over time, particularly given current events and current circumstances in the world. Again, if you know of anyone who's still interested in doing a PhD in this space, then by all means, feel free to put them in touch with me. Now, the challenge in looking at polarization, again, is that so much of the research in this space is dominated by American scholarship. And that's not, a criticism of American scholarship. It's just very difficult to make that work for anywhere else in the world. And of course, American scholarship is often this sort of thing where, there are surveys of how much Republicans hate Democrats and Democrats hate Republicans, or Republicans hate Democrat presidents and Democrats hate Republican presidents, how much further this is splitting apart. Although it's interesting in recent times also to see that this is starting to break up a little bit, because increasingly Americans hate both of their presidential options. So there is this sort of third party of people who really don't like either Trump or Biden or whoever else might stand in their place as well when they get too old. That's sort of a very American perspective, which again doesn't really translate so well to Europe. Now, what we've done in order to approach this a bit more is actually to go through the various ways that polarization has been defined, to really take stock of the various approaches to polarization that the literature shows us. I've got a QR code there if you're interested in this sort of thing and want to follow up a bit further as well. But essentially, in looking at polarization, we can divide between the micro level of individuals being polarized or becoming polarized against each other, the meso level of groups standing against each other, or of course the macro level of entirely polarized societies where it's really not just even individual groups, but there's a kind of a split through an entire society. And yes, maybe that works for the US, well, applies to the US. It probably doesn't work for them. But it probably doesn't translate so well to many European societies, for instance. There's also the question of whether polarization is at the mass level or at the elite level, so whether polarization between the political elites is actually much worse than polarization amongst the general public. That's these are some of the kind of key distinctions to begin with being made. Again, if you're interested in more on this, and I'll say a bit more about some of the other dimensions soon as well, we have some work on this quite recently and more forthcoming. The other question that's often asked is polarization based on what? So at the lowest level, perhaps there we could think of polarization on certain issues, whether that is, the war in Ukraine, the conflict in Gaza, abortion rights, trans rights, and so on. Any of these sorts of topics, of course, tend to result in strong disagreements over specific issues and specific policy responses to them as well. Sometimes these different issues start to align with each other, and there is this kind of partisan sorting that's starting to take place where groups of people tend to adopt the same positions on multiple issues because they align on one issue, so they look at what their fellow people on that issue think on other issues as well. So if you are, pro one issue, then perhaps you also start to be pro another issue, although these two issues have nothing necessarily to do with each other. So that then turns into more fundamental ideological polarization between these different groups. Quite often this also becomes affective. It has to do much more with identity and your emotional attachment to identity, to your in-groups or against the out-groups that you stand against, than necessarily a particularly rational choice about what the right policy is on a particular issue. So it becomes very emotionally and effectively driven as well. And then it also turns into a few other sort of effects of all of this. One is that perhaps your view of society also changes based on, how strongly you believe yourself to be. To take again the American example, a Republican or a Democrat, and you start to think of society as deeply divided because you actually happen to be deeply connected to one side of politics or one issue, for instance. And that then also often leads to interpretive polarization, which is that you and your opponent might encounter the same news report, for instance, but you will read it in entirely different ways. Supporters of different political parties, for instance, might see the same report and say that's great or that's really bad for the country, and it shows that the government's doing well or the government's not doing well, even if it's the same report, basically just reporting on the matters of the day. And finally, also, this might turn into interactional polarization, where based on your views of others, based on your views of perceived polarization, based on your views of issues, based on all of these other attributes around polarization, you start to interact preferentially with people who have the same beliefs or who you think have the same beliefs as you do. So that's a very quick run through polarization, the various aspects of polarization, and there are more. The more you work in this space, the more you read through literature, the more amazing it is. Work in this space, unfortunately, not much agrees with each other in many cases. And that is one of the big challenges of working in this space. So that's to set the scene really for what else I'm going to talk about here. The other point I also need to briefly talk about is polarization actually a problem? We tend to think it is because we tend to see, for instance, the US and the coup attempts at the Capitol that deep polarization can lead to. But we do still have to ask the question, is polarization actually fundamentally a problem? Or when does it become a problem? When does much more mild agonism or polarization actually really turn into societal dysfunction as well? How bad, in fact, is polarization at any one point in any given society on any particular issue or ideological difference, and does this constitute a problem for that society? So yeah, how bad is it? In some ways, we can, of course, quite justifiably say all politics is polarized. We wouldn't have different political parties if there wasn't some level of difference between them. And so to some extent, they are polarized against each other, of course. They have different views on issues. They have different ideological standpoints and so on. Just normally it doesn't go to the point of dysfunction where they actively start hating on each other and can't collaborate with each other anymore. So in many cases, we might just have agonism or perhaps at worst antagonism between these different groups in politics or in society more generally. Of course, again, moving away from the US example, most politics is actually, I would argue, multipolar rather than just bipolar. It's not just Republicans versus Democrats, but there's often many different views on any given issue and many different ideological points of view that you can pick. I don't really need to explain this in Germany, where there seems to be kind of new parties forming all the time. And particularly with the European elections, I've seen some very interesting posters just on the way over here as well, including that party that's asking where you will be in 800 years because we've solved aging and death. So, there are many different parties and many different positions on any issue out there. And in fact, the concentration on just Republicans versus Democrats in the US all the time seems to ignore all of that. And it's certainly, that's again why US research so often doesn't really apply to elsewhere in the world. The question ultimately then is, well, if we have agonism or mild antagonism between these parties, when does that actually turn into a more destructive form of polarization that damages society, that damages democracy, that starts to undermine democratic processes fundamentally? And in the work that we've done, we suggest that there are actually 5 key symptoms. I want to stress that this is a suggestion. There may be more, there may be others. These 5 might be able to be combined in different ways, but that's our best guess at this point, and we'd love to see feedback on this as well from people who are interested in this. We start by saying there's usually a breakdown of communication. That doesn't mean that there is no communication anymore between the different sides, but no constructive communication anymore. They might still shout at each other, they might still argue at each other and troll each other and so on, but they're probably no longer really trying to actually solve an issue by finding compromise, by finding shared points of view. So a breakdown of communication in that sense is, I think, one of the key symptoms. Part of that is also discrediting and dismissing the information that others provide, that the other side provides in these sorts of debates. Just fundamentally disagreeing and dismissing whatever they provide. That in itself is also often accompanied by an erasure of complexities, where a lot of things are simplified, for instance, to simple slogans and simple, posters and so on, obviously in campaigning, rather than actually dealing with the complexity of an issue. I could use, say, COVID as an example, where it's so much easier to say this is a bioweapon engineered by China than to say, well, viruses happen and sometimes they get really bad and then we have a pandemic. So that's also what I mean by erasure of complexity in the sort of extreme example. As part of that process, maybe as a result of these processes also, there tends to be more and more attention and space given in public debate to more extreme voices. For instance, those conspiracy theorists who say that, it's all Bill Gates implanting microchips rather than actual vaccines and so on. So it's that sort of that broadening of what's called the Overton window of what is allowable in public discourse and political discourse. That is, we think, also one of the key symptoms of destructive polarization. And finally, and this again goes back particularly to the question of affective polarization, exclusion through emotions, where you're no longer arguing the point where you're actually committing ad hominem attacks at the other side. You are saying that they're evil or that they are the Antichrist or whatever else, basically, that they're driven by some, by lizard people or whatever else it might be. I mean, these are extreme examples, obviously, but also more simple emotional appeals that are common, particularly also, of course, in populism, in populist arguments, where it's more about your sense of identity, your sense of belonging to a particular group of people, for instance, rather than anything to do with the actual argument in place. So that's as background in terms of the question of polarization that we're interested in our project. By now you're asking this probably, wasn't I going to talk about AI and AI in news and so on? Yes, I am. But I wanted to give you also the background to what I'm really going to talk about, or why we're interested in using AI as a research assistant in this sort of context. And part of the reason is also this. We are interested, in addition to polarization amongst coverage, you often end up with these sorts of images. This is, as you see there, from an organization called MediaBiasChart.com. If you look at it, it looks very intuitively not entirely wrong, perhaps. Some placements I would argue, but yeah, okay, there's a spectrum from again, in the US, obviously, there's a spectrum from left to right, liberal to conservative. There's some more reliable and mainstream sources. There's some that are more on the fringes and more ideological. And then there's simply fake news, or whatever you want to call that, mis and disinformation. So yeah, sure, that sounds about right, maybe. I mean, broadly speaking, but where is this coming from? What's the data, the underlying data? Through what methods have they arrived at this? He just put their reckons on a chart and said, yeah, we think there's a bit more left, there's a bit more right, and these are more reliable and so on. There is no methodology behind this. There is no actual really meaningful research behind this. This is simply, okay, yeah, this sounds about right, and if we put this out as a nice chart, then lots of people, including myself, of course, are going to use this. And that's problematic. So what we'd like to arrive at is actually something that maybe not quite replicates this, because again, A, I'm not that interested in US media, and B, I'm not that interested in just putting them on a left to right scale. But I'd certainly like to understand, well, what is the distribution of positioning of standpoints, perhaps, that these different outlets are taking on a given issue or on issues more generally. And yeah, are there maybe clusters of more or less reliable, more or less political, are there different ideological points of view that perhaps these different outlets are representing? And that's, I think, if you want to do that certainly at scale, then you may need AI to help you with that. The other aspect of this as well, and these are probably media that you won't recognize so much because this is from the Australian Digital News Report, but part of this is also, of course, once you know the positioning of media or maybe media audiences, you can also kind of see how audiences might see these media. So in this particular case, this is about the political orientation of Australian media audiences and the media that they consume. And you see there, for instance, that to the appropriately far right, there's Sky News Australia, not to be mistaken for Sky News UK. That's a totally different organization. And as far as I know, a perfectly fine news outlet. Sky News Australia is kind of to the right of Fox News. This is a reasonably good representation, perhaps, of sort of, again, just on a basic left-right scale, the positioning of news audiences for these Australian news media in an offline world. But if you then ask, what are you consuming online, suddenly things look entirely different. And, Sky News is somewhere near the center, actually, for some reason. So that's also part of what we're interested in. What is the positioning? How does news content and how do audience ideologies actually intersect with each other? That's also something that we're interested in. So in the first place, in order to get to these points, we're interested in accessing the polarization of news content. How do we work out, what the divisions are between different types of news content? And by extension, of course, can we perhaps also work out from that, if people are consuming this particular content, does that mean that they are also perhaps polarized in similar ways? In part, this is inspired, for instance, by work like this. This is from some years ago, where people looked at for instance, the climate change coverage in US news sources and found that the Wall Street Journal, as a very business-friendly journal, a newspaper, for instance, was least likely to discuss the impacts of and threat posed by climate change, most likely to include negative efficacy information and use conflict and negative economic framing when discussing actions to address climate change. So in other words, to put it more simply, they were more focused on the worries about what action against climate change would do to the economy. Then they were worried about what inaction against climate change would do to, well, everything. And that's maybe perfectly understandable from the position of a very pro-business newspaper. And of course, some of the other outlets were very differently positioned. Now, the way that these sorts of studies, and there's quite a few of them on this and other issues, do this is, of course, to do quantitative content analysis, often involving lots of manual coding of content, lots of reading and coding and sorting basically articles into different frames and positions that they represent, which is great, but which just doesn't scale very well. You can do this for a few hundred, maybe for a few thousand articles if you have maybe the funds to pay enough people to do it. But it gets very difficult if you want to do this at a much larger scale, perhaps over a longer period of time and across countries as well, which are all the sorts of things that we're interested in. So the question is, can we get our friend AI to read the news for us? Yeah, maybe not quite like this, but anyway. And so what are the questions that we might be able to ask then if we study this? Could we identify news coverage, for instance, who gets to speak, whose viewpoints are represented? Who are the people identified in news articles who actually have a direct or an indirect speaking role? How are they presented? How much are they visible? In what level of detail, what frequency of appearance? Is there direct attribution? Are they introduced in particular roles? Are they allowed direct speech? Are they directly quoted, or are they just paraphrased in indirect speech? What terms are being used in the journalistic framing of this as well? If someone from the mining industry, let's say, says, this climate action is going to wreck the economy, is the journalistic text around that picking up on these sorts of terms as well, or is it responding in a different way? Is it framing that statement as an exaggeration? So how do the journalists actually engage with the speech acts that they report? How does the language between these different speakers, actors, and stakeholders overlap with the language used by the journalists themselves? Is this consistent? I mean, is this just different from article to article, or is it actually, are there house styles for particular news outlets, as, for instance, that previous paper found using manual coding for the Wall Street Journal? Is it consistent over time as well? Is there actually a change over time as well as the climate crisis becomes more obvious to everyone? And is this the same across all these news outlets, or are there different styles that are really distinct for different outlets, maybe for different news organizations that own multiple outlets as well, and so on? And of course, then this is all still very much thinking about particular issues, but if you then look across different issues as well, are there actually similar divisions perhaps between outlets or different groups of outlets across issues as well? So are they ideologically sorted ultimately, not just sorted on particular issues? And of course, as we then also take into account how audiences perhaps respond to these outlets and to their coverage, is there actually some overlap? So does there appear to be essentially audience perceptions of polarization amongst these outlets as well? Are the audiences themselves polarized in a similar way to the outlets that they engage with? These are all the sorts of questions that we want to ask, and that we hope AI can answer for us as well. However, there's still a big but in here as well, and something that certainly has caused us a lot of concerns and issues as well. It is surprisingly difficult to find reliable data on news content, which you which you wouldn't necessarily expect. Go to any library website and you see all these wonderful news databases being advertised, and that's great if you want to do essentially qualitative research, want to download, for instance, a handful of articles and deal with those. Many of these data sets, and it's Factiva, ProQuest, LexisNexis, there's a bunch of others depending also on what country you're interested in. Many of them are, to begin with, very text-centric, and that's a problem because, again, with, for instance, major outlets like Sky News Australia, in Australia, a lot of their content is actually video-based, not so much text-based. But even if you just focus on text-based work, quite often there are big gaps in there as well. We have, for instance, we looked at ProQuest, and I think it doesn't have the FAZ, which in Germany can be a bit of a problem if you want to kind of get a full sense of coverage. Very often they are also, of course, they have to license their content, of course, from news providers. Very often that means that they're limited to the large-scale content that they can provide. It's very easy to download 100 articles from ProQuest, but it's very difficult to download 1,000 or 100,000 articles from it, for instance, for analysis. And that's, of course, the size levels that we're talking about when we talk about AI-based coding in the end. And of course, more and more with the rise of AI and the way that AI systems, foundation models, large language models are being trained, there is maybe, depending on how you think about it, a justifiable concern that news publishers have that a lot of their content is basically training data for AI, and that of course is happening without them seeing a single cent for that data. So quite a few of them are increasingly concerned also about the use of their content in AI training, and are even more reluctant to provide this kind of material than at scale to anyone, certainly to AI services. We asked, for instance, Factiva, could we get access to your API, which they do have? And the response was yes, for $30,000 per annum, and double that if you want to keep the data for longer than a year. That's not affordable for most research projects, certainly not the amount of money that we want to pay for this sort of thing. So what to do? Things were looking kind of complicated for a while. We think we now have a reasonable solution that we found. There is a service called NewsData.io, for instance, that provides what it says is an API to news content. The way that I think they work is basically that they do tracking of RSS feeds, if you remember those, and then scrape whatever content they see appear in those RSS feeds, which works well for non-paywalled sites, but not so much for paywalled sites. And I don't really want to think too hard about the legality of all of this in terms of copyright and so on, but this is a source for non-paywalled content. The other option, or the other additional option that we found, and I think I'm at a point where I can, cautiously recommend it, perhaps to others who are interested as well, is ProQuest's TDM studio. TDM, I think, stands for text data mining, or text, well, actually it says a text and data mining solution. That's a model that essentially provides, and if this gets too technical, then don't worry about it, but it provides a clean room environment where basically you log on to a server that they provide, which is connected to their data set, and you can basically download tens and hundreds of thousands of articles from their database to their provided server. You can do whatever you want on that. You just can't download it from there, and you can't connect out to the rest of the world from there. So that's what it offers, and it works well enough for that. What it doesn't provide is access to outside services like OpenAI, so you can't really use those kinds of tools, but you can install a local AI on their server, and that's good enough for our purposes, basically. So this hopefully will be a solution for paywall content, although more so for us in Australia and for work that we do on Canada, maybe on the US or UK. Germany is not particularly well covered, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say. Maybe that will change at some point. But these together are basically our solutions now to doing this sort of work. And that's what we've come up with then. I'll I think explain that in a slightly more readable way, but that's essentially from plugging these different sources together, or different tools together. That's now what we're pursuing. So to explain that a little bit more clearly, we have these two sources, news.io and ProQuest TDM. We are in the first place going to download in a standard sort of way articles and hand code them to have some sort of gold standard hand coded data set of content that we are happy with. And then we use that for training our AI, our large language models, over an iterative process of prompt development and prompt refinement in order then to have an AI coding system that can continue the work that we've been doing by hand and expand that to a much larger data set without losing a great deal of validity in doing it. And then, of course, again, starting with these sources, we can hopefully, we haven't done it yet, but that's the plan, do coding of a very large number of articles from our different sources via AI. So that's quite a lengthy and in-depth process of large-scale coding using those trained and tuned AI models, so that we can then finally analyze the large-scale data that we're interested in. So that's the plan in what we're looking to do. I would have loved to have been a little bit further advanced and give you some of the final outcomes of all of this as well. But again, it's taken us quite a long time to just even find the data. But this is sort of where we've got to now in this process. We have, for instance, working prototypes to identify the diversity of viewpoints in articles. And what I mean by that is, again, who is speaking, how are they identified? How are they introduced? What roles are they given? Who are they said to represent? So not just, what's the role, but are they representing government or some other organization or whatever? Are they given, again, the right to speak directly, or are they paraphrased in indirect speech? Of course, most importantly, what did they say? What is the actual point that they're expressing? And some of this, it looks like it will also be a lot more successful if we prime this work, prime the AI process itself with named entity recognition to actually pull out already some of the names and some of the identities, some of the entities that we know are present in the data set in these articles. So we can specifically ask the AI, I know that Jane Smith is talking in this article. Who is that person? What are they saying? And so on, and get more detail on what they're saying. And again, stance detection, we're also starting to move forward on. So what is it actually? What's the stance that they represent? So if they're saying something, the government's doing fine, what is the stance that represents, for instance? That's sort of the next steps that we're interested in. What we're also exploring in that process is, and this is, I'm going to show you a slide that actually has less to do with news content, but it translates to this as well. And sorry, there's a lot on there, so don't worry too much about the details. But essentially building a pipeline that plugs together some of these different things, and in fact plugs together some of the standard tools of natural language processing, of which named entity recognition, of course, is one. But there are a number of other tools that we can throw at this as well that have less to do with AI as such, but really have to do more with the analysis simply of the textual content. Including things obviously like also topic modeling and dependency parsing and part of speech parsing and so on. So there's a bunch of fairly established tools. These again we can prepend. We can use them to prime the further AI process as well by actually getting out of the natural language processing whatever we can get out of it and use that as input that further refines what we then ask the AI to do further. And then finally, of course, again, also look at what these positions represent in terms of the polarizing aspects of what they're saying as well. So, for instance, how are they talking about in groups and out groups? How strongly are they? How strongly effective is the language that they're using? Are they talking quite in a quite neutral tone and quite rationally about their opponents, for instance, or is the language that they're using highly emotional and highly aggressive as well? So that's really where we start to get further towards the the question of polarization there as well. And I need to thank particularly my colleague Tariq Shukair for the work that he's been doing in this sort of space to begin with. What we're finding already with all of this is that, in fact, developing these sorts of approaches and doing this kind of work is highly dependent on the tools that you're using. That may not be much of a surprise, but we're finding even between, for instance, ChatGPT 3.5 and 4.0, the results that you're getting, the quality of the results that you're getting, also the way that it reads things can be very different. And that's a challenge for all of us. It's kind of working with almost an unreliable coder. One way I've heard the working with AI described is that you have a not particularly intelligent but very opinionated research assistant who thinks that they know everything and will tell you what they think you want to hear. And that's something that we have to work against constantly, essentially. We're finding that these different models, whenever there's a new model or a new version coming out, the results can be very, very different. It also helps, in fact, because, again, the AI kind of wants to be helpful and wants to, categorize everything that it can. It does help to give it the option to say, I don't know what this is. I don't understand what this is. I'm putting it into another category. I'm putting it into a category of, uncertainty. Doing that explicitly, rather than just hoping for the AI to say, I'm not sure what I'm looking at here, can help quite significantly as well. So that's one of the important things that we, and I think a lot of other people, are learning as well. And in fact, asking it also not just to categorize, to classify, to say this is what this is, but to explain as well how it is choosing the codes that it's applying can help as well. So I'm sorry, this is going to sound really weird, getting the AI to think about what it's saying tends to help as well. And of course, adds a level of retraceability and verifiability to this as well. We can actually go back and understand, why is it saying this? Why is that so wrong? And why is it getting our prompt wrong, basically? So it helps us in refining our prompt ultimately as well. And that's, in fact, also one of the things that iterative fine-tuning process, particularly also against human-coded gold standard data sets, can significantly improve performance. But of course, as with all kinds of fine-tuning and coding and tuning against a particular sample of data, it might so we've got to be quite careful about this work as well. And of course, all of this is ultimately evaluated clearly against the human-coded data. That's not a question. But it appears also to be useful to run the same LLM multiple times over the same data. So you basically have multiple AI coders that with each run might actually also slightly or not so slightly disagree with each other. So you can kind of calculate intercoder reliability between multiple iterations of the same AI, or even between multiple different AIs that you're running over the same data. Of course, with each of that, it increases the cost and the processing time and all of that. So there's a limit to how much you can do that as well, depending on your funding schemes. But that can also help and can I guess, help you kind of get more of an average opinion of these multiple AI runs than occasionally get one really outlier result that it just gives you because it just happened to hallucinate a little bit at the time. In all of this, of course, it's also really important to remind ourselves that human coders don't always disagree. In fact, very often don't agree on how they're coding things as well. So we should not expect a perfect result any more from the AI coding than we do from the human coding, particularly with genuinely difficult topics and with genuinely unclear coders will be. And sometimes, of course, human coders will also tell you, oh, well, I really have to choose a category here. I don't just want to say other all the time. So sometimes human coders actually fall into that trap of really wanting to do what you want them to do, which is to clearly tell you, yes, this is absolutely, left wing, right wing, whatever, when in fact it might not be. So we've got to be quite careful about that with humans as much as with AI as well. And sometimes, it would be suspicious if we have perfect agreement all the time. Either we've just asked a question that's too simple, or something actually has badly gone wrong in the coding process to begin with. then also looking at some of the more complex questions like frame analysis, for instance, not just what's being said and by whom and what stances does this represent, but also at the level of the article, what frames is the article actually putting on all of this as well. That may still be very topic specific. In framing climate reporting, for instance, we might, I'm sure we can all think of a bunch of frames that are quite common, but frames for reporting on the Ukraine war or the war in Gaza or whatever might be quite different. So having some sort of general approach that takes any data and finds a frame may be difficult to arrive at. It may be necessary, for instance, to do some initial topic modeling to kind of see what topics are represented, and maybe these can be translated in frames that you then ask the AI to look for, and of course the human coders to look for as well. So that may be one approach that we can take, but then that also means that we have to do this for each broad topic area separately. Again, we may also be able to enrich and pre-process all the data that we're putting in through those natural language processing techniques that aren't themselves strictly AI, of course. The other big challenge, and I've mentioned this briefly before, is dealing with non-textual data, because so much content overall and so much news content also increasingly is, of course, image and audio and video based, is non-textual in various forms, from conventional news reporting in broadcast or streaming services to Instagram and YouTube and TikTok, obviously. So that's also very much a challenge. There is some good work emerging around simply the AI transcription of audiovisual content. So the audio transcription, that's fairly straightforward now. Even if you're on Zoom and you switch on the subtitles, that tends to work reasonably well if you haven't got a very bad accent. But that in itself, particularly for news content, is not enough, because very often you'll have multiple speakers there as well. So you've got to be able to determine who is currently speaking and who do they represent and so on. So some of that may be done by taking into account the image as well. If you've got a caption there that says this is the Bundeskanzler, or this is the opposition leader or whatever, then of course that might help you identify who's currently speaking. But so often, of course, in news reports also the image and the audio don't necessarily align with each other, because they're using more fancy editing techniques, for instance. There is some work emerging there, and we're exploring this a little bit ourselves as well, that doesn't necessarily involve analyzing the entire image content of videos, but for instance, picking out the key frames or the kind of more stable images. And of course, again, doing optical character recognition and pulling out any text that might be in the video itself, superimposed. That's still got some way to go, but that might help to some extent. There is some more work also in voice recognition, not so much in identifying speakers by their voice, but at least identifying that there are different people speaking and picking on those. So some of that might be working. We have a tool in-house as well called the image machine that's very good at taking still images and clustering them by their content. So taking a whole bunch of images and then in a hierarchical way saying, well, these contain people, these don't. These contain one person or multiple people, and these don't, and so on. And basically a more and more diverse and detailed clustering of images based on their content. That can help also, of course, with this sort of work. But there is a lot more work that still needs to be done in all of this, and I think will happen probably also reasonably quickly with all of this, but it still has a way to go. So I think audio and video content is still very much a challenge at this point, and we'll see how far we can get there in the short term. So I've sort of talked about where we're sort of at, or what we understand in terms of the AI, I guess, coding of content, so using AI as research assistant in that sense. I do want to finish up by just talking a little bit more on what do we then do with all of that as well. What's the point? So we've coded all this stuff. We know now what the patterns are, perhaps. And I wanted to show you something that is still a very early prototype, but we think we're onto something that actually might be ultimately quite powerful for these sorts of purposes. And we're calling this at the moment practice mapping. And I need to thank particularly my PhD student, Katerina Kazianenko, for coming up with that term. So really, this started, I guess, with us being, in the first place, quite unhappy with network analysis, in fact, because so often network analysis gives us some, very, formless, shapeless networks of all sorts of interactions being mapped out, but not really any kind of clear ideas of the different groups that are involved in this. But a lot of this ends up having to do with the kind of news content coding that I've talked about as well. So just bear with me on that one. Like very often we get these sorts of network graphs, basically, and we're seeing here, we're seeing that there's more green on that side, more red on that side, but overall it's pretty shapeless. And this essentially is probably one of the last Twitter network graphs I'll ever produce, given the lack of access to data we now have. But basically, this is from public debates around a referendum on Indigenous recognition that we've had in Australia recently, which failed. Largely it shows this because, of course, it's not that the two sides aren't talking to each other. They're talking a lot to each other, just not in a very meaningful, constructive way. They're shouting at each other. They're telling each other they're wrong. So as a network, there's lots of connection there, but it might still be a breakdown of communication, might still be destructive polarization. So how do we get from this to something more useful for our purposes where we can identify different groups? And the way that we've now explored this, and we've done this quite successfully, is to say we're not just mapping the connections between people, but we're actually looking at what their practices are, and then we're mapping the similarities between those practices. So if I tweet 5 times at Andreas and mention you 6 times, and you tweet 5 times at Andreas and mention you 6 times, we've got exactly the same practices. We've got exactly the same patterns of behavior, even though we might not be connected with each other at all because we haven't tweeted at each other. So the idea is here to compare the overall practices that people have in terms of their interactions with others, but also in terms of the content that they share, in terms of the topics that they address, in terms of any other features that we can bring into this as well, and then to calculate the similarities between those practices and compare these across the entire population of users, accounts, individual participants that we have, whatever the context is that we're doing this in. And that results in this. And that's a very different visualization. That's a much clearer indication of, in fact, in this case, polarization, of distance, of difference between them. We can then also look at what practices these different clusters represent, and we see there that, in fact, we have a strong anti-voice, so anti-referendum group there on the one side. We've got a strong pro-referendum group on the other side, but also that, particularly on the what is the left side of Australian politics, there's actually quite a bit of division amongst them as well, because some people genuinely care about Indigenous recognition. Some people are involved in the fight because it's something that the Labour Party kicked off and they're pro-Labour. And those two groups don't actually necessarily coordinate very well. And that really was part of the problem, part of the reason that this referendum failed in Australia, that we had Labour Party hacks on the one side, Indigenous activists on the other, and they actually don't get along particularly well. So they were far less coordinated than the right and the far right of Australian politics, who are basically both against the great Indigenous recognition and against the Labour Party. So this seems to work reasonably well, and this is, as I say, very much a prototype of what we're interested in. But then, of course, and this is where I'm getting back to the AI coding and the use of AIs as research assistants in all of this as well. In addition to just the interactions that we have between these accounts that we can look at in this way, the patterns, the similarities in practices in terms of interactions on a platform between accounts, we can also look at their content. And again, some of this will be AI coded, the topics that they address, the sentiment that they express, of course, hashtags and things that they include, the people that they name, the use of sources, the URLs, the domains that they're sharing, and particularly then also looking at the content, for instance, of news articles, the points of view that this represents, and the kinds of people who get to speak in them, and so on. So we can bring all of this information in, and that's part of their practices as well. So we can include all of that in what we compare from each account to the next as well. Of course, their profile information, other details might also be added to this, and any other both manually and computationally coded, analyzed information about the accounts, about the posts, about the content that we can think of as well. So all of that put together then gets us to a mapping of practices that goes well beyond network mapping and its limitations, and actually looks at the similarities between these different groups and how they engage with each other and with content as well. So that's where I think our journey is going with this, and we'll have more to say. We'll prepare some more work and share that fairly soon on this idea of practice mapping and some of the practices of practice mapping. We'll have to find a way to express this well without tripping over ourselves, but essentially how we can do this kind of work and make it happen, particularly also with AI support, of course. And that then again gets us back to that question that I started with: do we see evidence of destructive polarization? So if the mapping of these practices shows distinct practices, then we can look at what are the practices that they represent, what are the patterns of activity that these different practices represent. Is there something in there that is problematic, that shows the kinds of symptoms that we're looking at? So the patterns of activity that these different groups show, do they map onto the symptoms of destructive polarization that we've identified? Maybe we might also find some new symptoms that we haven't thought of yet, that aren't on that list of 5 symptoms yet. Maybe we need to combine some of the symptoms that we've identified because they always occur together. That remains to be seen. That's the empirical part of this work, obviously, as well. And of course, we can then also see, well, how distinct are these practices, and maybe by extension, how severe then are the differences between these different groups? Can we then start to interpret these differences as a sign of genuine destructive polarization rather than just differences in practices as well? And of course, if we look at this over time, how do these patterns evolve over time as well? And if we get all of that done, we can relax and have the AI do all the work for us, of course, which is, of course, the end point of all work. With that, I'll finish. Maybe we've got a little bit of time for questions as well. This is the image you get from Midjourney if you ask it for time's up, end of time. So doesn't quite look like that outside, luckily enough. So thank you very much. And hopefully we've got a bit of time for questions. You usually can, because of course most of these, the kind of standard, sort of industry standard LLMs have been trained, particularly also on news content. So they will have seen a lot of this sort of language as well, and actually have trained on it. So I'm just going to say about the light because it's blinding me. But so that is certainly true, and so they often will actually understand this kind of language. Well, understand as much as an AI understands everything, but they will be able to parse that kind of language, even if it is a very euphemistic political expression, rather than maybe the way that an ordinary person would talk about the same issue. Often they are. I mean, it depends on how encapsulated and how complicated the language gets, I think. But for most political expression, they're actually quite good at parsing this. Maybe even better at parsing this than how ordinary people speak, because of the way that they've been trained. Yes. No, that's a really good question, and yes, you clearly know Australian politics quite well, because yes, there are some influential and fairly rich, at least, individuals in Australia who are not necessarily in favor of doing more work, for instance, in the direction of climate change, or in a number of other contexts as well. I mean, this is like it is, I think, though, anywhere else as well. Of course, there are plenty of foundations and other organizations that provide philanthropic funding to the right people as well. I guess we tend to stay clear where we know that there is a clear political agenda behind them, or where it's likely that there is a clear political agenda, or where it might even give the impression that we are making ourselves vulnerable to the agenda of funders. So I would generally stay away from those. A lot of the work that we're doing is funded by organizations like the Australian Research Council, so a government-funded organization. There are in some ways, we're a little bit insulated from this in Australia, because very often well, there isn't a lot of philanthropy in the country to begin with. So funders like Gina Reinhardt, for instance, and some of the other mining barons are not in the business of giving money to researchers unless it is to find better ways to extract coal and gas from the ground.
And now to go in that direction to get...
Not much, to be honest, at this point. No. And I mean, if anything, what we've often done with our research is to see where they have had lobby groups that they funded who are trying to push public debate in a specific direction. So for us at this point, I don't think it's a massive issue, but of course we look very closely at where the money is coming from that we're using. And
because with other countries,
yes,
and it's really tempting to
yes.
get the money, and you're always in need of money. It's not just you.
Of course.
Research, and we've got always a big discussion.
Of course.
Economy people.
Yeah. Yeah, and often it's also just about the contracts that you have with them and making very clear that they're not able to influence the direction of the research. But yeah. For instance, when it genuinely leads to a contest of ideas. So if we have different views on, how I don't even know what is a good example, but on how a particular issue should be resolved. That might be a productive form of polarization, where genuinely different political parties or other groups in society are arguing with each other about what should we be doing about this issue. When, of course, they're genuinely arguing with each other, not just pushing their ideas and ignoring the other side of the debate. I mean, I don't know, maybe this is a really bad example, but just over the last few weeks, as I've been in Germany, I've seen the news, things like the FDP putting forward their new ideas for how the government should actually be doing things. That's different from what they've agreed to the government should be doing. That's maybe not a particularly constructive way of doing things, but in theory, of course, a party could... Yeah, parties do put forward their ideas for how they would, operate in government. And if they are genuinely negotiating with their partners in government, then that might be a resolution of, or the sort of the product of productive polarization, where they're coming to it with different ideas. They will still have different ideas perhaps by the end of it, but they find a way to arrange and to pursue a middle ground, I guess, that couldn't have emerged without them actually having that productive agonism between the different sides. That's how I would see productive polarization. Of course, the more they stop listening to each other, and again, current examples, aren't hard to find, and the more they just dig in on their positions without actually listening to the other side, the more problematic that becomes and the more unproductive it becomes, maybe to the point where it actually becomes destructive. Does that make sense? And I think that's really the point. It's a continuum. It's not just that at some point it suddenly turns destructive, but there are levels from more productive to more destructive kinds of debates. And in fact, you're right. I mean, you could, in a sense, you could flip the 5 symptoms around, and the opposite of those might be productive. No, but and there's a lot of gray area in between. But if you have an absence of a breakdown of communication, and the different sides, even though they have different opinions, continue to talk to each other. If they talk to each other without excluding each other by emotional language, if they're not saying you're evil, you're wrong, you're stupid or whatever, but are actually genuinely arguing the point, and it doesn't mean an absence of affect, it just means an absence of the abuse of affect to exclude. So that's also really important. There is an important role for affect in politics as well, but not to the point where you're saying you're evil. It's just that I feel very strongly about this, you feel very strongly about this. Let's see if there's not still a way that we can come together and come to a compromise. So that's breakdown of communication. That's exclusion through emotions. It's also not providing a lot of space for extreme voices. So I mean, you could negate all the symptoms and then say, well, these would be the symptoms of productive polarization, even though there's still different views and there is still a polarization between these different points. They're doing it in a way that's still productive and constructive, I guess. Okay, yeah. So starting with the first part, yes, look, absolutely, and that's also how we get populism, of course. People don't necessarily want to be confronted with the complexities of everyday life, and so having easy solutions, having easy answers, is very seductive. Ultimately, it's very attractive, and yeah, that's why we've always had populists. There's always there's always that danger from populist answers becoming very popular, because they are so intuitively right. So, if we just left the EU, everything would be better, as we've seen in the UK, and that's turned out. That's a very easy answer. It's all the EU's fault. The UK by itself could do so much better and would be so much freer and so much more able to follow its own ideas, and all of that were being held back. So that's a clear example of an erasure of complexities. Actually you're benefiting from the EU as much as you're giving to it, and that's clearly one argument won and the other didn't, and we see the result. So there is always that danger, and to some extent, of course, I don't want to be. This will sound weird, but I don't want to be entirely critical of populism either, because sometimes having simple answers, solutions, slogans, whatever, is also important in mobilizing people, in motivating people. Black Lives Matter is a very simple thing. Me Too is a very simple thing, ultimately. It's literally 3 or 2 words, but it's also very powerful in mobilizing people to seek positive change. So sometimes you do have to erode these complexities, but in a sense, also in a way perhaps that still shows there is a lot of complexity under this. Black Lives Matter, but also, and then what? So what is it that we then want? Me Too, but also, what should be done about that? Not just let's leave the EU and we'll leave the rest for later, and we'll work it out once we've left, kind of thing. So that there's a difference there in using these simple slogans to mobilize, but also still thinking ahead beyond the slogan itself. And that, I think, is maybe the distinction also between a more destructive and a more productive way of using these slogans. And so accounting for biases in human causes, that's a really old problem as well, of course. And in part, some of that you may never be able to entirely deal with either, because, of course, depending on how you recruit your coders, they might be coming from a reasonably similar background, for instance, same country or same context or whatever. And of course, you yourself, as the person developing the code books and so on, may not be free of that either. So the main thing is to be, I think, aware of that, to also be as clear as possible in instructing your coders and developing your code books, and ultimately also acknowledging that as a limitation, that if we do this study in Australia, it might actually turn out somewhat different from the study if it's done in Germany or in France or in Iraq, because of the preconceived notions or the fundamental worldview that people might have that's slightly different between different countries, different groups. Yeah, that's a really significant problem, I think, partly also because so much of the data ultimately that we're dealing with tends to be proprietary as well, of course. So it's very difficult often to share the data sets even that we're working on so that someone can replicate the work that we've done. That's true for social media data, that's true for news data, as I've shown as well. So in the first place, I guess, one incomplete answer is documentation, thorough documentation. What kinds of data sets have you worked with? How did you gather them? How might someone else be able to gather them as well? What are the steps that you took in working with the data in a really detailed way? Now, that can't always be done in journal articles because of limited space, but in appendices and other methodological documentation. It needs to be done, I think. So how did you work with these data sets? What were the steps that you took? Also, what were the specific tools that you used? Again, it's not enough to just say we use ChatGPT because, 3 is very different from 3.5, is very different from 4. So you really got to be quite specific about the particular version and the steps that you might have taken to train it as well, and all of these things. Plus, of course, sharing code that computer code that you've developed to do all of this as well. We actually do end up doing a lot of that as well. Putting some of the tools that we're developing on our GitHub and these sorts of things as well. So someone else can actually use these tools as well. None of these are complete answers to your question, because so much we're dealing with proprietary data. We might be using proprietary systems, AI systems that, again, we have no control over. That might be different from one day to the next, depending on what versions they are. So none of this completely solves this, but at least documenting as much as we can and sharing as much of the, if not the data themselves, that's certainly the code books that we're using, the computer code that we're using and all of that, so that people have a chance to follow and check and replicate the work that we're doing. I think that's the basics, and anything we can do beyond that by developing ways in which we can share data in a safe and ethically sound and I guess copyright sound way as well, it would be very valuable as well. But there are some real hurdles, unfortunately, to that as well. Maybe less so in Europe with the DSA and so on than in many other countries where there isn't that sort of legal protection for research, actually. I'm maybe somewhere on the fence on this one, because news is still important. I think news still, if you look at social media, news still also circulates, maybe in different ways and different formats now than it used to, but a lot of public debate is ultimately still informed by news in some way. Not always by people who've read the entire article or who are sharing, even the source content so much, but maybe by people who talk about what they've read or who share a screenshot from an article or whatever. So there is still a lot of that sort of news content circulating and news content informing public debate. I think that is still very much the case. Now, where we might need to adjust and where perhaps we're a little bit old-fashioned in looking at the news content as well, it is quite possible that we might actually need to look more at news headlines, news images, so the stuff that people see when they see a news story posted on Facebook or wherever, and maybe also, of course, more of the visual and audiovisual and moving image news content as well. That's for instance on TikTok or other platforms where it certainly isn't. It's not really a linked article, but there is a brief video from Tagesschau or something that ends up circulating. So we might need to adjust to the kinds of formats that people are likely to encounter. Having said all of that, and that's another open question, I think that some projects might be able to answer. When you see news content circulate on social media, for instance, when you see that stuff is going on in the world, how likely are people then to still go and Google it, for instance? I'm seeing, okay, something happened in whatever. Do I then, if this is of interest to me, maybe I'm not seeking that purely on the social media platform that I'm on, but maybe I'm going and doing a search for that as a result of having seen it. And maybe then also I go back to the social media platform and inform others about what I've seen. So I think some of the search aspects of all of this also need to be understood much better still. And search, in some ways, for all of its importance, has been really under-researched, I think. There isn't nearly enough research on the way that people search, what they search for, what they're getting out of that, what they see when they run a search and so on, I think, than there should be. And particularly also how that intersects with the rest of their media repertoire and their social media repertoire as well. So I think we might need to go in that direction a bit more. And I know, having been in Hamburg, I've talked to Lisa Merten of the Poltrack project, which does some of that work as well, looking at, for instance, they have data on what a panel of users do online, basically, just what URLs they visit. And there, yes, you can look at, okay, they've been on Facebook and then The next thing is they searched for something, and then maybe they went back to Facebook or whatever. Maybe that happens, maybe it doesn't. That's the sort of research, I think, connecting these different parts of the internet together, or the web together, that we actually need more information on as well. But it's difficult. It's methodologically difficult as well, particularly, of course, when it happens more and more on mobile devices, where the way that people switch between apps and what they do is a lot harder to track than even it used to be when we were using desktop computers. Yeah, and I mean, journalists, of course, track all of these patterns of how people consume news very closely as well, and understanding what they're seeing, knowing from them where they think their audience are getting their news. And of course, some news organizations, again, shift very much to other platforms because they know that that's where the audience now is. So that is very, very important, I think. Yeah. Yeah, look, I mean, yes, it's difficult, as particularly that sort of, I don't know, that plain vanilla part in the middle somewhere that isn't really very strongly one way or the other. Again, some of that I think we end up approaching probably by saying to the AI, well, if you can't really decide, is it one way or the other, then say so. Maybe even asking it for a confidence level or something. How strongly do you feel that this is going in one way or the other direction? And some of that is simply also what, you would do with a human coder, of course, as well. If the coder comes and says, well, it's so slightly to that side, but actually not very strong, and I'm not really quite sure about this, then capturing that is important rather than making either a human or an AI coder say, yes, it's definitely on that side or definitely on that side. How well that will work at scale and how much of the content it will simply leave somewhere in the sort of the middle, I don't know yet, to be honest. No, that's something once we apply this to really larger data sets and once we kind of get a sense of what the patterns are, we will get to a clearer understanding of this. It is also, frankly, quite likely that a lot of news content, a lot of news reporting is actually still relatively neutral. I mean, we're not particularly... maybe again in the US it might be different, some other places might be different, but we're in Australia, we're not in a position where we only have far right and far left news outlets. We have a lot of stuff in the middle that actually just reports and that's it, and doesn't really put much of a spin on it. We would want to see that as well, I think, because in some ways it also tells us that yes, there is still that kind of common ground somewhere. In some ways, we're not desperately searching for polarization where there isn't any. And if we don't find that, then that's a good thing in some ways as well. But I think, particularly as we look at this across different countries, across different topics as well, I would expect to see that more in some areas than in others. So if we see it just across the board uniformly, then something's wrong in what we're doing. But if we see, a lot of polarization on something, I don't know, like climate change, and not so much on whatever another topic is that isn't as polarized, then that's probably an indication that it's working reasonably well. So that's sort of where I'd hope to get to.
Thanks a lot for your talk, the discussion.